Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Propervarian and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 42, Cultural Secessions. This is a great one because it really leads us down a path that isn't possible in other games, but it is a path that I hope other games will adopt as soon as they can. For example, I could see something like this and a mechanic focused around what Victoria 3 does here play a role in EU5. I gotta tell you, I personally would love that because currently the way cultures and cultural suppression and conversion works in EU4 is just so arcadey. They have, instead this model now where you can say we can have this sort of gameplay as an anti-blobbing mechanic and at the same time also as an intuitive real-life simulating mechanic as well. Again, very positive about this dev diary. We shall walk through it as per usual, but before this I would like to address a different topic, and that is the question of the Victoria 3 leak. If you follow Victoria 3's development, if you are interested in this, then you may have heard of this, you may even have used it. Supposedly a dev build basically has been leaked under whatever circumstances, I don't know. And the big question that I want to address today is, will I be talking about mechanics, screenshots and so on that can be seen in that dev build? I want to put every single question about, is it right, is it wrong to have it, is it in a good state, is it in a bad state? I want to put all of this aside because I think most of that is mostly academic. I don't think any of those discussions lead anywhere outside of just, hey, saying some things. No, what I want to do instead is address the fact and my intention of not covering the leak whatsoever. The reason for this isn't really of any moral nature or whatever, it is more of the idea that when we do something in this channel, when we want to cover something about Victoria 3, the way I approach it is that I fundamentally sit down, try to understand where the devs are coming from. So A, I try to see whether their vision here is something that I can agree with, and B, I try to look at whether their vision then was even implemented in a way that makes me happy. This is something that we can do when it comes to, for example, dev diaries, because in dev diaries there will always be a marker on this mechanic isn't final, we will rework this, or this mechanic is exactly how we see it, so working as designed. There's also, of course, something about dev diaries like, for example, the Warfare dev diary, where they very clearly say this is just the theory, the practice hasn't been implemented properly yet. And then there are dev diaries such as, for example, interest groups, politics, the economy, where everything in its, rough circumstances has already been decided. So there is the state before implementation, but where we have the theory and we can judge the theory. And then there's the state where we have the practice and we can judge the practice both in whether it is fun and, of course, in whether it actually is true to the theory. Now, the leak doesn't enable me to do any of this. In the leak, if I look at a mechanic, if I look at anything and I say I don't like this or I do like this, those features could internally already be something that are already going to be overhauled, or that the devs said, hey, this is going to get cut, we're going to do something else there because this didn't really work out. Any feedback that I could give, any feedback that anybody could give, is 99% of the time utterly useless. I browse the Discord server, of course, I browse the subreddit, and I have seen so many people point out, oh, the UI is too large, and the UI is one of those things that is made at the latest point in game development, at least finalized, because we're looking at a situation where, while you are still working on mechanics, the UI doesn't even know what actually needs to be displayed in it. Meaning that its size, its form, and so on, not to mention, of course, that scalability is a thing. I can't describe how many posts I have seen on the subreddit complaining about the size of the UI, when that is something that is scalable in the newer games, for example, in CK3, but I even think in EU4. When we look at all those things, right, we have features that are clearly not done, and even if they are done, we can't actually tell. Any feedback that I could give on that is utterly worthless. If we see something in the dev diaries, we can see the dev's intentions and then interpret it based on this. Again, I don't hold it against you. If your curiosity says I want to check out the leak, perfectly reasonable, I understand it. Obviously, if you want to share anything about it in the comments when it comes to, for example, leaked material itself, then you will be banned from the channel. I think that is not a new policy here at all. But what I will say for myself for the channel is basically it would just be useless talking about a mechanic that I couldn't evaluate whether it is working as designed or not. And if something is broken and I say this is broken, it sucks, then I didn't actually add anything to the conversation. So with that being said, I hope that you understand why I'm of this opinion. I gotta tell you, to be quite frank, I have been fairly frustrated with the subreddit on this topic, because it's all just such useless feedback at this point, where like none of it actually plays a role for the devs or for the community reaction, because we're seeing something that is literally the hottest of code released by, well, whoever released it, right? But something that is clearly unfinished and wasn't meant to be seen anywhere because it's in the works. And it really does give me just the impression that the people that think they are giving valuable feedback, they have no idea how software development works, how project development in general, for example, in marketing and such works. And with that in mind, it's just such a waste of time. The subreddit is sadly currently useless. With all that being said, just wanted to explain that because it is, of course, a big topic, I get it, but we now have the dev diary in front of us. I will also be covering the AAR that happened yesterday. There is so much good stuff in there with explanations for how things should work and what currently isn't working, so that is something that I'm very interested in. They played the Ottomans. Wiz, Martin Anwar, sat down and played them for, I think, 4 hours, maybe 4.5 hours. It's quite some time. So I'm very eager to go through that during the weekend. Now, cultural secessions it is. Today we will discuss another type of civil war, cultural secessions, which is where pops in your nation of a certain culture demand their right to self-determination and carve out their own country from yours. These types of civil wars have some similarity in mechanics, but ultimately serve two very different purposes. Just like revolutions can be seen as a failure to balance the economic and political needs of different classes against each other, secessions can be seen as a failure to see to the needs of pops of certain cultures within your borders. So we're looking fundamentally on a total societal breakdown, which then leads to a revolution, because the pops that should be on your side, that are not discriminated against by your state, are suddenly rising up, and of course that is a failure. And this one, so the secessions in particular, are about you suppressing a certain culture and that culture having enough, and clearly having enough power to actually rise up. This is not a given necessarily. Now, this is not a mechanic either. In basically every single Paradox game, let me think, Imperator Rome, of course, EU Rome, of course, as well, but I mean, that's a very old game. EU4 does it, CK3 does it, but CK3 does it very, very nicely now. CK3 is a very different game, of course, because it is focused on characters, but the way characters interact with culture now is so sweet, because it actually looks at culture in a much more complex way than done before. We have that, we have Stellaris, of course, we have Hoi 4, we have Victoria 2, all of them interact with different cultures that you take over as you go. And you can have a multicultural empire that is very, very friendly towards other cultures, or you can have one that is very, very indeed negative towards them. And this is important because Victoria's period is basically packed with people suppressing other cultures, meaning this mechanic isn't just your typical anti-blobbing mechanic that is supposed to slow you down, make you, take some steps that bind your resources and calm down your empire. This is a mechanic that is vital for the inherent nature of this very period. I mean, just think about the springtime of nations, when, for example, Russia aided the Austro-Hungarians to, well, actually the Austrians, aided the Austrians to suppress the Hungarians so that Russia wouldn't see any rebellions on their own side of things. Then, of course, you have the Polish that attempted to rebel again and again in this period and were suppressed by 3 major factions, by Prussia, Austria, and, of course, Russia. These all play a huge topic, and I hope, or rather it has to be said, this mechanic is vital beyond anti-blobbing mechanics. This is a direct impact of having a pop system. You need to take care of the system, and this is of course already a pretty good start. They're fundamentally saying that this is as natural as it is if you fail to, basically please your own population. And that is important, because in many other games, even in CK3 and EU4 without a doubt, in Stellaris as well, non or other cultures, other species that rise up against you, they're mostly a footnote. They're just something that happens on the side that you might have to suppress. But here it is supposed to play a bigger role. Often this can come about as the result of aggressive expansion or systematic oppression of pops of certain cultures, or indeed the religions commonly associated with those cultures. Just like revolutions, there are several paths to go down in order to deal with the problems secessionists might cause. This is the key. The revolutions, or rather this dev diary, was a great dev diary because it gave you so many allies on how to interact with it. This one as well gives you many allies. Let's take a look at how this is even caused and how it is shown. Turmoil is the effect of having too many radicals in your country, and has effects both on the state level and on entire cultures worldwide. Important, please take note of this. To understand cultural secessions, we have to understand turmoil a bit better first. Turmoil measures social friction and conflicts between pops. This can include crime, violence, angry protests, and more. When a substantial part of a state's total population are made up of radicals, turmoil is created and negative effects start to be applied. There's a certain amount of tax waste, modeling all the different costs of the types of unrest turmoil represents, and the state's migration attraction decreases substantially, because nobody wants to move to an area where trouble is brewing. This has to be pointed out as well, turmoil clearly means very, very many things. This is not a topic of it's just people going now against your state. It can be corruption, it can be crime, it can be just a general breakdown of social structures, and the result is a general tax waste. Whether this is corruption, whether this is because there is a rebellious population that refuses to pay taxes, this is up to you. This is up to your interpretation, and you can see it right here in Lafayette. And by the way, my god, I love these roads. It makes me sad every time I see it. It makes me so sad because CK3 really needs this flavor on the map as well. It's just so saddening to see. Well, it's great obviously for Victoria 3 to see this right here. To see these roads, to see these farm estates right there, as well as down here, of course, and to see the city itself that gets updated with buildings as you upgrade it. And then CK3 is just like, here's a bishopric, here's a castle, and so on. I really need whoever worked on this to also come to CK3 and do it seriously. But let's focus on this. Lafayette obviously in a bad spot. Turmoil. Turmoil from Radical Pops, 31.34%, minus 50% migration attraction, and plus 25% tax waste. So this is a pretty influential impact here. Now, obviously, this means that whenever you can, you want to avoid turmoil. That is the best, so that your budget, so that your household isn't suffering. But sometimes you can't do that, and that is either because, you know, for example, I don't know, you don't want to do it, or because you literally can't change it, be that with violence or with reform. Let's take a look at this, because they do go into this, and I absolutely love it. Radicals can originate from a number of sources, including drops in material wealth, being below the minimum expected standard of living, or supporting a movement that's not being listened to. We had that in particular in the last week as well, of course, when it comes to revolutions, when it comes to restoring a law, and so on. And what is very important here is, of course, the differentiation that if you lose material wealth, even if you are above the minimum still, you will, or you have the potential to become radicalized. Makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you suffer, you might say this society isn't taking care of me. I am unable to sustain what I had. My, descendants won't be having a good life as I had it, and this makes you angry. All of a sudden, you are anti this state, anti this society. But there is an additional potential negative here, that is if they actually go below the minimum of their expected standard of living. So if their pop type expects X or Y, then they might say, you know what, we are below this now, and this is unacceptable. So there is basically a mild form, a soft form of them getting radicalized, and then there's the harsh form. And this is very important, because this should mean that as long as you aren't underneath the minimum, you can probably still deal with this, still move along, and try to get these radicals de-radicalized, because it's not too many. But once they actually do go below the minimum, your country, your society is effectively falling apart. But one additional major cause of radicalism tends to be discrimination, particular discrimination of literate pops. I love this as well, because this means, in theory, let's say you are discriminating against culture B and your society is led by culture A. This means if you, for example, introduce an education system that could be, for example, private, and the pops in culture B don't have any good jobs because you aren't building factories there, because nothing is happening there, they might not actually even rise up. They just accept their lot because they haven't read what the world is like, they haven't seen what is going on and how much better they could have it, right? And with that in mind, they actually simply accept their lot. You could prolong basically your aggressive, your suppressive rule over this culture B simply by, for example, having a private system of education that they simply can't afford, meaning their literacy rate doesn't go up, meaning they are very unlikely to radicalize. This is really, really neat, because it is one of these natural gameplay mechanics that gives you a realistic outcome and actually has realistic responses as well. Which begs the question, if discrimination creates radicals and radicals lead to turmoil and turmoil hurts your economy, why would any country discriminate against parts of their population in the first place? I love that they asked this question. It doesn't seem like something too big, but this is something that I don't think EU4 ever asked. To be fair, and I want to stress this, EU4 is not my favorite game. I know for many others it is, and I like that. Of course, they should enjoy their game. But what I will say is that EU4, without a doubt, in its core is much more arcadey. It is much more a board game. And in EU4, you don't really ask the question, are these people rising up because there are realistic reasons, or do they rise up because we need an anti-blobbing rise-up mechanic? Yeah, in EU4 they mostly just focus on the latter, and in Victoria 3, and this is why this is so important to me, they have the game that focuses the most on the former option, so on the option on why do people actually rise up, what is the reasoning behind it. When I, for example, look at Stellaris, they sort of try to do it, but not really. CK3 is absolutely miserable about this. maybe this is a bit too harsh a judgment, but having read a bit about the why peasants were rising up in medieval Europe, none of them really were the reason of, hey, you are simply of a different culture. Obviously, this is now softened, and in a very good way, because in CK3 you have now a mechanic that leads you down a way where you can have cultural acceptance, but mostly, they just rose up if you wanted to take away their rights. When you wanted to say you are no longer freemen, you are now serfs, and none of that is simulated in CK3, so CK3 doesn't actually ask, why do people rise up? Whereas Victoria 3 does it. Again, huge plus points from my side. First, discrimination is governed by laws, and most countries start out with laws that would cause certain cultures or religions to be discriminated against, even if such pops aren't even present in the country a game starts. Of course, it makes sense, just because you aren't, you know, multi-ethnic or multicultural or multi-religious, that doesn't mean that in the case you would become multi-religious and so on, you wouldn't discriminate against them. It makes a lot of sense. You don't pick and choose which cultures or religions to discriminate against. It's all based on your laws and how similar other cultures and religions are to your country's primary culture and religion. This is a very, very, very sensible focus, because it really does make it so that you have a realistic sort of legislation. Obviously, for example, when you look at the United States of America and on their 19th century China policies and how they dealt with Chinese migrants, or, well, how aggressive they actually dealt around this topic, they sometimes do focus on just one specific ethnicity, culture. Well, actually, China, of course, has many ethnicities, but they just focus on one nation, so to speak. And this is one of those things that couldn't probably be simulated here, but it could be simulated enough, because you could focus on a very specific culture and how far are they away. For example, if you are of European heritage, that is very different from being of East Asian heritage, making it so that even if you don't want to discriminate against other people that are a bit closer to you, you can still discriminate against East Asians, and with that, of course, including the Chinese pops that might migrate to you. This is important because this is the only way to really simulate this. You could do it culture by culture. Stellaris does this, right? But, I mean, they do it species by species, but that also, I mean, I don't know. I think this solution is fine because it leads to realistic en masse sort of solutions, rather than to a situation where you fine-tune everything and then you can make it so that only one culture is upset. No. Instead, it should be something that leads you sometimes into an impasse, where sometimes you might upset more people than you actually wanted, so that you can then have a backlash and interesting gameplay coming with that. That is how I see it. Of course, again, it's not granular enough to really give you exactly the realistic experience, but I think it is just granular enough to give you exactly what this felt like, when it comes to the gameplay impact that such a situation would have. Now, where were we? Right, these laws are supported by interest groups, so while you can try to put an end to your discriminatory practices by changing the citizenship and church and state laws, certain groups might not be pleased with you if you do. Just great stuff. The fact that, of course, yes, you are Russia, yes, you are multicultural, and yes, you won't be getting rid of those discrimination laws anytime soon, because your landowners and so on are so influential that if you did it, they would rebel. That's great. I mean, that's exactly the gameplay loop that you need to have. The establishment needs to be in favor of these laws, even if it creates turmoil and tax losses and maybe rebellions. But sometimes you shouldn't have a choice, even though technically it's the optimal play to give everybody equal rights. It's not, because there are old factors, there are old powers that you need to, basically go against first if you want to get rid of this practice. Second, and I love this, discriminated pops get paid less than their non-discriminated peers. This in turn makes ownership shareholders and potentially all non-discriminated pops in states where discriminated pops live richer, as they get a larger piece of the productivity pie. This, of course, means they get a productivity pie, or they get more from it, because first of all, if they are the capitalists or the owners of this building in general, then they will be in a situation where they just make more profit. But it also means that if you need to pay less wages, you can actually offer this good at a lesser price, making it so that everybody, straight up everybody in your society benefits from this discrimination. And this is how you natively and just naturally create these sort of oppressive systems, because they just make sense in the greater context of your population wanting a certain good at a certain low price. I love that they thought about this in this depth, because this really, really shows the sort of appeal that an oppressive system can have for the people that aren't oppressed, because they just indirectly completely benefit, of course, from the exploitation. This approach, if you just compare it to Stellaris, to EU4, not at all present. I hope that more games look towards Victoria 3, maybe not with pops, but with this idea of why are people suppressing other people, what's the benefit. Victoria 3 is, again, really, really good about this here, no doubt about it. Where were we? We were right here. Therefore, putting an end to discrimination would hurt their personal finances, which causes them to radicalize, and they have more political strength to hurt you with than the discriminated pops do. Makes sense. Third, discriminated pops have considerably less political strength than their peers. If you're worried about potential uprisings, getting rid of discriminatory practices could certainly help you in the long term, but in the short term, while they are still radical, it will empower the formerly discriminated to make stronger demands. It might be tempting to retain a status quo unless you are prepared to take the fight with both the conservative elements of your society and the newly equal citizens who might want to see a few changes. I love this. This really it combines the old guard with, the people that are no longer discriminated against and that you have given autonomy quite potentially, but that now say, you know what, we want actually to have independence. The way Victoria 3 approaches this is the best way any grand strategy game has ever done it. I do keep up with Grey Eminence's Dev Diaries. I'm so far very much on the fence, not sure how to feel about it, but that is the only game where I would say maybe they can do something similar, better, worse, I'm not sure. Obviously the game isn't out, it's very, very far away, but what Victoria 3 does here is the best that Paradox has ever done, and I think that any other grand strategy game has done as well. It looks at the nature of oppression, at the nature of exploitation, and asks, why do we do it? Why is it something that is necessitated by the old order, and how can you get rid of it? Which effects will this have? Other games do not ask this question. They simply say, hey, you either just need to press the button to suppress the rebellion, you can convert it, and so on. This is completely gone in Victoria 3. It just makes sense what is happening here. But since discrimination occurs on a cultural basis, and if not cultural, then often religious, which often maps back to a certain culture anyway, of course, for example, you have Armenians who are, in their vast majority, of course, Armenian Orthodox, right? That's the official term there. And that is something that then will stick to their culture, as is largely anyway. So if you, discriminate against Christians, then you will basically discriminate against most, if not all, Armenians in this context. This means that even if pops of a certain culture represent a small proportion of the population in your country, the proportion of pops within that culture that are radical could be very large indeed. So in addition to measuring turmoil on the state level, we also measure it on a culture level and on a culture in country level. This is very, very cool. The Maghrebi culture might not have very high turmoil overall because most of them live in Tunis and Morocco, where they aren't discriminated against. That is, of course, a country that is led by them. But within France, the turmoil among Maghrebi pops could reach higher levels. So this would show the global stats. I assume the standard of living, probably also these general stats, although this should be the same for all Maghrebi pops, so I think globally will only show a different standard of living, right? But this is just in France here, so what we're seeing right here, and they are impoverished on average, which gives us the impression that clearly the vast majority of Maghrebi characters in France are of the lower strata, because they are at 10.3, and then middle and upper strata are quite well off. They don't really have anything to complain about, but there are also so few people that they barely have an impact on the overall average standard of living of this culture. Now here we have some interesting stuff. Maghrebi culture is discriminated. This is pointed out right here. Very cool. Cultural traits, Arab speaking and Middle Eastern heritage. So the language, the religion, the culture, the heritage, which I basically believe is to be the fundamental ethnicity or maybe the fundamental cultural area. I think both of those can be interpreted into this. Those are tracked, those are very neat to see, because this is exactly how you know whether you will be discriminating against them with a certain law or not. And then here we have the cultural turmoil, and this is really good. Cultural turmoil, global Maghrebi turmoil is quite low, but the Maghrebi turmoil in France is 7.26%. This is good, because as we're going to see later, if a country experiences an issue with a culture within their realm, and that culture actually rises up, other parts of that culture in other realms might, then via the global turmoil, might decide to also rise up. I love this. And this does leave me, basically with a question. We're going to see it later in an example as well. But the Springtime of Nations, for example, where Hungarians rose up and the Russians got involved, in particular because they feared that this would lead to minorities rising up in general. I do wish that this isn't just something where, for example, the Poles in Russia rise up and then the Poles in Prussia decide this is the time we rise up now, which is basically the Springtime of Nations, right? But instead, that maybe even a neighboring or a close by or a culturally related culture, that they also decide maybe we could rise up. It's not mentioned in this dev diary, but the fear that Russia had and why they got involved in this rebellion in Austria in 1848, 1849 was fundamentally based on the fact that liberalism and that, other cultures rising up, minorities demanding sovereignty and so on, was something that Tsardom feared. And you kind of don't have this effect if you just do this, you know, if you say, hey, Hungarians in Austria rise up, everywhere Hungarians might rise up now. You don't really have this effect because the Russians just don't have any Hungarian positions. But if it's still translated to, for example, the Tatars is how you pronounce it, right? That they might rise up, that, I don't know, the Circassians might rise up. If you see this trouble, then you might have a situation where Russia genuinely says it's in my interest to come in and deal with this. Whether that will be in the game, again, it's not mentioned. I assume this is currently not a factor, it's just per this culture, but that's an interesting thought that came to me, because that is a huge chunk of why the Springtime of Nations was as violent and as suppressed as it was. It's not, you know, something that, hey, they just ignore, oh, the Hungarians are rebelling, well, that's no business of mine, I'm not gonna deal with this. No, 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 this is a big, big role, and again, I do hope that this might be seen in the actual gameplay as well. As we know from the migration diary, if a whole culture has high turmoil, this can result in the emergence of mass migration targets, states across the globe that temporarily gain the ability for pops of those cultures to mass migrate there. Yep, we've seen that before. But if pops in a country suffer high turmoil and live in one of their cultural homelands, they may instead start a secession movement. So this is where secession movements come in. If I suppress your culture where you are not native to, you will simply leave. If I suppress your culture in your native lands, you might be willing to rise up. This could be the case for the Maghrebi population of Algiers, for example. They're not only being oppressed, but they're being oppressed on land they feel is theirs by right, and the obvious solution is to kick the French out of there. However, an Algerian that moves to Nice after their homeland was colonized and introduced to the French market will not try to start a secession movement for a Maghrebian sovereign state in southern France. Do keep in mind, though, if he is in a situation where he is suppressed by France and Algeria rises up and becomes independent, he would be very, very likely to migrate to Algeria. Lovely. Absolutely good stuff. A secession movement functions a lot like a revolutionary movement. It will gradually escalate in intensity until it reaches a threshold, after which point one or several states will break off from the country to form their own, then launch a diplomatic play. Much like revolutionary and political movements, you can deal with these by trying to fix the underlying issues, whether the discrimination or the lack of material comforts, or by suppressing the troublemakers using decrees or the Home Affairs institution. So quite similar when it comes to revolutions, except these don't want to, you know, annex you, these just want to be independent. If you can get the situation back under control, you can dodge the secession for this time, but the movement might of course return if conditions worsen. Classic stuff. You can also deal with it more permanently by simply ceding the land to secessionists. In this case, you would release a nation, including all homelands of that culture in your possession. One benefit of this approach is that you can release the nation as a subject, permitting you to still meddle in their affairs and exploit their economy, even while you grant them at least some degree of self-determination. With no homelands now left in your possession, the secessionist movement will vanish immediately. I'm not sure about this. This is the thing that I'm critical about when it comes to this dev diary, because it leaves us in a situation where if I know I can't deal with this, let's say I'm Russia, let's say Prussia wants to destroy me, you know, and the Polish population rebels in my country. So I know, for example, the Prussian player or the Prussian AI will move against me. I know this, right? If I release Congress Poland, all of a sudden, I would have no trouble with them anymore. Yes, to a degree, you could say, hey, okay, now that this is a puppet relationship, Poland itself might start a diplomatic play for more independence or for total independence, but this is something I can address much more easily than addressing the secessionist movement. Because to address the secessionist movement itself, what I have to address are living conditions, political strength, for example, cultural cohesion, discrimination laws, and so on. If it's just a puppet and it's just diplomatic relationships, I kind of just need to improve relations, right? So, I don't think this is a good solution. At that point, I can literally still starve out the Polish people by making it so nothing will be built in that region. I will, for example, if they produce something, I could literally undermine their production, you know, since they would still be in my market if I release them as a subject. I do not like this. I think this is not that good, because it ultimately leads you into a situation where oftentimes, since they are still a part of your market, since they most likely are puppets that will have to go to war with you, you still have their potential. You still have their potential. And I think it is probably going to be easier to keep track of them and to keep them under your boot as a diplomatic nation, rather than as a nation that, you know, actually is part of your society and is suppressed by your society. I don't know whether this is the best solution. I understand obviously where this comes from, but we've already seen in the Canada AAR that if Canada has a revolution, or, you know, changes their regime in a peaceful way, and they do this and are communists now, Great Britain can't do anything. In reality, of course, if Congress Poland went nationalist, you know, and said, we are the Polish nation and we will be independent, or if they said, we're communists now, I mean, come on, Russia would get involved, right? But as it stands, it doesn't appear that Victoria 3 allows you to get involved in those circumstances, but vice versa. It also seems easier to please a country that you dislike, that is basically just under your boot. It seems easier to please them via the diplomatic options than via actually elevating the population from poverty and so on. Yeah, this solution doesn't... I mean, first of all, I like it, of course. You can release them. I hope the options here are plenty, basically, and I like that you can play as them as well. That's a great thing, but... this just seems like the easy way out. And long term, you could still, you know, just annex them via diplomatic play anyway. Kind of hard. Honestly, just, I don't think I'm the biggest fan of this. I think there need to be more cultural specific and diplomacy specific options when it comes to a cultural minority release country and the overlord. Those currently don't seem to be there. Right. But if you do not do any of these things, the secession will take place. This launches a diplomatic play where the country seceded from automatically gains the crush the uprising war goal, which if enforced, will return the seceded states to their possession. The secessionists, on the other hand, only need to defend themselves. Unlike with revolutions, a secession can, sort of by definition, result in a wide peace where the seceding country is simply left to exist. Makes a lot of sense. Just like in revolutionary plays, other countries with interests or certain pacts are able to intervene on behalf of either country. Most importantly, if the culture seceding is already a primary culture in another country, for Maghrebi, that would be Tunis, that country is automatically invited to join the play on the defender's side. This is a big one. We haven't seen anything about this, and you can technically do this in a roundabout way. Hear me out here, right? If you sit down and you look at somebody else's market, and that somebody else has a culture in particular, and this will sound, it would sound so counterintuitive, but if somebody, for example, Russia is suppressing the Poles, and let's stick with that example because, again, it's a very good example. There are Krakow, for example, where Polish is a primary influence. Let's say Krakow all of a sudden becomes a giant when it comes to production and so on. And they see that in Poland, in the Russian market, Poland is making most of their wealth, most of the things that keep the Polish population within Russia happy. They are primarily making that money, let's say, by building cars. What you could do is you are Krakow and you start relentlessly importing cars and other materials that will bankrupt whatever is going on industry-wise in Poland itself, so in Congress Poland. You start importing cars into that area, bankrupting their economy, making them lose standard of living, making them maybe go under the minimum, and making them basically be radicals. Then they rebel, and you can aid them, right? But you need to harm your own population for this. I do think what would be really neat here would be mechanics that allow you to meddle with this. I haven't seen any of it yet, and you clearly can already meddle with it with, for example, what I just described, but it's not really a dedicated mechanic. There's no, okay, you know what, I want to agitate, I want to, for example, spread literacy in this culture group, in this empire, because I want them to rebel, and to rebel they must be radical, and to be radical they must be literate. You can't really do any of these things. You can't indoctrinate them, quote-unquote, where you go, hey, believe in the Polish nation, we are from Krakow, we're the gods of this world, and we can do it, right? These options don't seem to exist. You literally need to bankrupt, you need to get rid of the standard of living, meaning you need to harm your own population in this territory to make it happen. I wish this was more multi-dimensional when it comes to this topic, and that would also then make it relevant for example, released nations that would be secessionists. For example, if Russia releases Poland, Poland is just fine with Russia now because they just have diplomatic interactions. Russia can't really get involved. What if Krakow then went to Congress Poland and said, hey, you are a bootlicker right now, but we can work this out together. We can work against them. I wish that this would be something that can actually take place, that there would be a dedicated mechanic to this. I currently am not seeing it. That is basically, I think, my biggest criticism of this entire thing when it comes to how you can interact with the issues of other nations, the secession movements of other nations, and how you can maybe help them succeed, be it in a puppet or be it within an empire itself. Now, with that criticism out of the way, here comes the part that I really, really love. In addition, as soon as such a secession play is commenced, there is a chance that secessionist movements for this culture will break out in other countries, even if they don't meet the turmoil threshold. A classic example for this is Poland. Polish Pops live on homelands across Prussia, Austria, and Russia. If any one of these countries mistreat the Poles to the point where they break away and form Poland, Polish pan-nationalist movements might break out in the other two countries as well. This potentially means having to fight all three countries for their independence. I'm not sure what this means. Will the three great powers unite in crushing the Polish nationalist movement, or perhaps one will graciously give up the parcel of land to Poland and start bankrolling them instead, hoping for to weaken their rivals and maybe gain a new puppet state in the process? I don't know about this. I don't know about this because if they all rebel, Russia will only fight the Prussian Poles, Russia will only fight the Russian Poles, and Austria will only fight the Austrian Poles. And that's just... you know what I mean? Like, this fundamental mechanic is awesome. I love this. If an active rebellion is going on, it is much, much easier for other rebellions of the same sort to start. I love this. This is huge, this is great. Big, big fan. But what does it actually mean? Because if the Polish states, or if the Polish form three individual states during their rebellion against Russia and so on, you would be looking at a situation where all of a sudden they all just get crushed because they aren't working together, they aren't in a war together. Whereas on the other side, of course, if they are fighting all three at the same time, this could also be a disaster. This is a topic where I'm saying this is something that I want to see in every single game, but there are some uncertainties about this that I do not fully comprehend at this time, that I need to see explored, and that seem underexplored to me at this moment. There might already be mechanics and they just haven't talked about it. That is difficult to say. But this is a big topic for me. Yeah, no, this is definitely a big topic for me. That's exactly how I would phrase it. Ultimately, I really, really love this mechanic. This approach to make it so that you can suppress them, that you can release them, that you can give them genuine freedom potentially as a puppet, right? But as you as an overlord are very uninvolved in the internal policies of your puppet, all of a sudden you could have a communist puppet and I mean, what's happening? You know what I mean? This is just one of those things where I am not so certain whether this is where I want it to be, but the core of this is absolutely excellent. And yeah, by the way, I really, really like the map here. Cultural secession and turmoil is a pretty classic take on anti-blobbing mechanics, of course it is. If you aggressively expand too quickly, your new subjects will get angry, will become more of a liability than an asset to you, and may even try to take their land back. But with Victoria's thematic focus on nation-states and pan-nationalism, these interact with the core mechanics of pops, cultures, homelands, radicals, turmoil, and diplomatic plays to give you more tools to influence the situation than just pacing your conquests. This is what I meant when I talked about this at the start of this video. I love the fundamental approach that they have here. I have various questions about getting involved in another nation's cultural upheavals, right? And about actually dealing with upheavals within my own secessionist movement, whether it is, for example, you know, releasing the country and then they're all happy with me despite still being under my boot. These are the questions that I have, but all in all, I think this is hugely, hugely positive. I'm a big, big fan of this, and I think that this could naturally lead to the Springtime of Nations. I just feel a bit uncertain about some of the additional mechanics talked about here and how they will actually play out in the game. But that is very difficult to say for the moment. Of course, this is it for this one. That's all for me from me for a little while. Next week, Overloaf will give us a peek at how we handle a very special butterfly of a civil war that's not really a revolution, not really a cultural secession, but that includes elements from both the American Civil War. Very important topic because this is a revolution of non-discriminated pops that want to secede. What happens there? How is it done? And could we have this maybe as a generalist setting? I haven't really seen it in... I talked about this actually on the Discord just recently. I was asking, hey, is there any other example where an established culture that is the majority culture, where they want to rebel against the old order but not take it over, just become independent? Because I can't name a single one. 1848, 1849 in France was a clear revolution. For example, in Germany was a clear revolution, was actually about unifying the countries, right? In Austria it was minority secessions primarily, similar to Russia as well, of course. In Italy you had unification movements as well, but that isn't the same as just saying, okay, we want a secession or something like that. I'm very interested in the American Civil War. I can't see any other examples, so maybe making this sort of mechanic exclusive to the ACW makes sense. Honestly, not sure. Either way, let me know what you think. This was a very, very long, very good Dev Diary, and of course the talk before that on the topic of the leaks. I'm very open to hear all your thoughts on this. Again, I have criticisms, but all in all, this is what any given Paradox game should look at in the future as far as I'm concerned. Maybe not with pops, but with the approach of asking the legitimate question, why is there suppression, and why and when would people rise up against it? That is very, very well done. For the moment, I will leave you here, and I will see you later, alligator.